Outlaw's daughter was promised in marriage, until the groom learned her shocking truth. She carried her father's name and a killer's secret. But when her gentle groom brought her wildflowers, Elena Cartwright realized some truths are too heavy for love to carry. The dust never settled in Devil's Ridge. It hung in the air like the ghosts of dead men, coating everything in a fine layer of regret. Samuel Black Sam Cartwright rode into town that October morning with his daughter beside him, their horses moving slow and deliberate through the empty streets. The sun bled crimson behind them, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the church at the far end of town. Elena sat straight in her saddle, her dark hair braided tight against her neck, her hands steady on the reins. 17 years old, with her mother's gentle eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. She wore her only good dress, blue calico that had seen better days, but still carried the scent of lavender her mother used to love. In her pocket, wrapped in a piece of torn cloth, lay a silver locket stained with blood that wouldn't come clean no matter how hard she scrubbed. "You remember what we talked about," Sam said, his voice rough as sandpaper. His beard was more gray than black now, and the lines around his eyes spoke of too many years spent looking over his shoulder. "This marriage is your chance at something clean, something honest." Elena nodded, but her fingers found the locket through the fabric of her dress. The metal felt cold even through the cloth, cold as the moment she'd pulled it from the preacher's dying hands, cold as the truth she'd never told her father. The Brennan ranch sprawled across the valley like a promise of prosperity. White fences marked boundaries that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon, and cattle grazed in fields so green they looked painted against the brown wilderness. The house stood 2 stories tall, with a wraparound porch and windows that caught the morning light like hope itself. Thomas Brennan waited on the porch steps, hat in hand, his sandy hair catching the breeze. He was tall and lean, with calloused hands that spoke of honest work and eyes that had never seen the inside of a jail cell. When he smiled at Elena, it was like sunrise after the longest night she'd ever known. "Miss Cartwright," he said, stepping forward as they dismounted. His voice carried the soft drawl of a man who'd never had to raise it in anger. "I hope the ride wasn't too hard on you." "No harder than most," Elena replied, accepting his offered hand to step down from her horse. His palm was warm and rough with work, clean in a way that made her want to pull away. She'd killed a man with hands like these. Sam and Thomas's father, William Brennan, shook hands with the careful formality of men doing business they both needed but neither fully trusted. William was a large man with kind eyes and a banker's careful smile. His ranch had prospered through honest dealing and hard work, everything Sam's life of robbery and violence was not. "The arrangements are as we discussed," William said. "The wedding tomorrow at noon. Then Thomas and Elena will take the small house by the creek until they can build their own." Elena listened to them plan her future like she was a piece of livestock being traded. But when Thomas touched her elbow gently, guiding her toward the house, she felt something she'd never expected, the possibility of peace. Inside, the house smelled of fresh bread and wood polish. Mrs. Brennan, a soft woman with flour on her apron, fussed over Elena like she was already family. The kitchen was warm and bright, with yellow curtains that danced in the window breeze and a table that could seat 8 people in comfort. "You must be tired from the ride," Mrs. Brennan said, pouring Elena a cup of coffee that steamed like incense in the morning light. "Thomas has been beside himself with worry, checking the road every hour since dawn." Elena glanced at Thomas, who ducked his head with embarrassment. The gesture was so boyish, so innocent, that her chest tightened with something that might have been hope if she'd let it be. "I brought you something," Thomas said quietly, reaching into his vest pocket. He pulled out a small bundle of wildflowers, purple lupin and yellow Indian paintbrush tied with a piece of brown string. "I know they're not much, but I thought you might like them." The flowers trembled in Elena's hands. No one had ever given her flowers before. Her life had been campfires and stolen moments between towns, always running, always hiding. She pressed them to her nose and breathed in their clean, sweet scent so different from the metallic smell that haunted her dreams. "They're beautiful," she whispered, and meant it. That evening, after Sam had ridden back to his camp in the hills, Elena sat on the porch swing with Thomas as the sun died behind the mountains. The air smelled of sage and coming rain, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly in their contentment. "I want you to know," Thomas said, his voice careful and low, "I don't care what your father's done. I don't care about his past. What matters to me is who you are." Elena's hand went to her pocket, to the locket that seemed to burn against her leg. "And what if you don't like who I am?" Thomas turned to face her, his eyes serious in the fading light. "I think you're kind. I think you're strong. I think you've seen things no young woman should have to see, and that's made you careful, maybe even afraid. But I also think there's something good in you that's been waiting for a chance to grow." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that there was nothing good left in her, that she'd stained herself beyond any hope of washing clean. Instead, she nodded and looked away, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Later, alone in the small room Mrs. Brennan had prepared for her, Elena sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pulled the locket from her pocket. The silver was tarnished now, and the blood had turned to rust-colored stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Inside was a picture of a woman she'd never known. The preacher's wife, probably, or maybe his daughter. Someone who'd loved him before Elena had been forced to cut his throat in a wagon outside Tombstone. She told herself it was self-defense. He'd cornered her when her father was in the saloon, pressed her against the wagon wheel with hands that grabbed, and she'd had her father's knife in her boot, and when he wouldn't stop, when his breath was hot and whiskey sour against her neck, she'd used it. Quick and clean, the way Sam had taught her. But the preacher's eyes as he died, surprised and afraid and human, haunted her still. She'd taken the locket from his vest, some twisted proof of what she'd done, and now it felt like a chain around her soul. Outside her window, she could hear Thomas moving around in the barn, checking on the horses one last time. His footsteps were steady and unhurried, the movements of a man at peace with his place in the world. Tomorrow, she would stand beside him and promise to love and honor him, knowing she carried death in her pocket and lies in her heart. Elena held the locket up to the lamplight, watching the stains catch the flame like tiny drops of fire. Thomas deserved better than a killer's daughter. He deserved better than her. But as she tucked the locket back into her dress, Elena found herself thinking of the wildflowers he'd given her, now pressed between the pages of his mother's Bible on the dresser. Maybe redemption wasn't about forgetting the past. Maybe it was about finding someone who could love you anyway. The thought terrified her more than any gun she'd ever faced. In the morning, she would walk toward the altar carrying both hope and horror in equal measure, not knowing that love's true test wasn't in the vowing, but in the telling of truth. Thomas brought her wildflowers every morning, speaking of their children's names. But Elena knew that when he learned what her hands had done, love would turn to ash in his mouth. The morning came soft and golden, spilling through the lace curtains of Elena's room like honey poured slow from a jar. She woke to the sound of Thomas moving in the yard below, his voice low and gentle as he spoke to the horses. For a moment, in that space between sleep and waking, she almost forgot what she carried in her pocket. Then her fingers found the locket, and the weight of it brought everything back. Mrs. Brennan had breakfast waiting, eggs fresh from the hen house, bacon that crackled in the iron skillet, and biscuits that rose like small miracles from the oven. The kitchen smelled of home in a way Elena had never known, warm and safe and permanent. She sat at the table feeling like an imposter in a life that wasn't meant for her. Thomas rode out early to check the far pasture. "Mrs. Brennan said, setting a plate before Elena with motherly care. "But he left these for you." On the windowsill sat another small bundle of wildflowers. White daisies this time, still damp with morning dew and tied with the same brown string. Elena touched them with fingertips that remembered the warm slick of blood, and her throat closed tight. "He's a good boy, Mrs. Brennan continued, settling into her chair with her own cup of coffee. "Never given us a moment's trouble. When his father told him about the arrangement, He didn't complain once. Said if she was Black Sam's daughter, she needs someone to treat her gentle. The words were meant as comfort, but they cut Elena deep. Thomas had accepted her before he'd even met her, seen past her father's reputation to something he hoped might be worth saving. And here she sat, letting him pour his kindness over her like water on poisoned ground. After breakfast, Elena walked the grounds of the ranch, needing air and space to think. The morning was crisp with the promise of winter, and the mountains stood purple against the blue sky. Everything here spoke of permanence: the solid barn, the straight fence lines, the cattle that grazed without fear. It was the opposite of everything she'd known, where safety was measured in how fast you could run, and trust was a luxury no one could afford. She found Thomas by the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, his sleeves rolled up as he mended a section of fence. He looked up when she approached, and his face brightened with a smile that made her chest ache. "Morning," he said, setting down his hammer. "Sleep well?" "Well enough." Elena sat on a fallen log nearby, watching him work. His movements were economical and sure, the kind of competence that came from a lifetime of useful labor. "Your mother says you've been up since dawn." "Habit, I guess." "Ranch doesn't run itself." He paused in his work, looking at her with those honest blue eyes. "Elena, I want you to know about tomorrow. I don't expect anything from you that you're not ready to give. Marriage is more than, well, it's about partnership. Respect. I hope we can build something good together, even if it takes time." The kindness in his voice was like a physical blow. Elena felt tears threaten behind her eyes and turned away, focusing on the water that ran clear and cold over the creek stones. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't worth his patience, that she carried darkness he couldn't imagine. Instead, she asked, "What do you want from life, Thomas?" He considered this, wiping his hands on a piece of cloth. "I want to build something that lasts. Raise children who know right from wrong. Be the kind of man who leaves the world a little better than he found it." He glanced at her sideways. "What about you?" Elena almost laughed at the question. What did she want? To sleep without nightmares. To wash the blood from her hands that wasn't really there anymore, but felt permanent to be worthy of the trust she saw in Thomas's eyes. "I want to be good," she said finally, the words coming out like a confession. "You are good," Thomas said with such certainty that Elena's heart broke a little. "I can see it in how you gentle the horses, how you help my mother without being asked. Good isn't about where you come from, Elena. It's about what you choose to do." That afternoon, Sheriff Watson rode up to the house on a horse that had seen better days, dust coating his badge and his expression grim as winter. Elena watched from the kitchen window as he spoke with William Brennan on the porch, their voices too low to hear, but their body language tense. "Wonder what brings the sheriff out here, Mrs." Brennan murmured, pausing in her bread kneading. Elena's hand went to her pocket, to the locket that seemed to pulse with accusation. Through the glass, she could see Sheriff Watson's weathered face, his eyes scanning the yard like he was looking for something specific. Someone specific. When William came inside, his expression was carefully neutral. "Sheriff's asking about strangers who might have passed through recently. Seems there was some trouble over in Bitter Creek a few weeks back." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Bitter Creek was where she'd killed the preacher, where she'd left his body beside the wagon and ridden hard for 3 days straight, the locket clutched in her bloody fist like evidence of her damnation. "What kind of trouble, Mrs.?" Brennan asked, her hands still working the dough. "A traveling preacher was found dead. Throat cut." William's eyes found Elena's for just a moment. "Sheriff's following the trail of anyone who might have been in the area." Elena forced herself to nod, to look concerned but not terrified. "That's terrible." The poor man. But inside, her world was crumbling. The sheriff was following her trail, connecting the dots that would lead him here, to this kitchen that smelled of bread and hope, to Thomas who brought her wildflowers and spoke of their future children. In a day, maybe 2, Sheriff Watson would have enough pieces to point his finger at Black Sam's daughter and destroy everything Thomas believed about her. That evening, As they sat on the porch swing watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of fire, Thomas took her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused from honest work, and Elena had to fight the urge to pull away. "I've been thinking about names," he said softly. "For our children, I mean, if we're blessed with them." Elena's throat closed. "Names? For a boy, maybe Samuel, after your father. Show him we're not ashamed of where we come from." Thomas's thumb traced gentle circles on her knuckles. "For a girl, I was thinking Rose. My grandmother's name. She was the strongest woman I ever knew." The image hit Elena like a punch to the chest. A little girl with Thomas's gentle eyes, growing up in this house of peace and plenty, never knowing her mother was a killer. She pulled her hand free and stood, walking to the porch rail where she gripped the wood until her knuckles went white. "Elena." Thomas's voice was soft with concern. "Did I say something wrong?" She turned to face him, this good man who wanted to give her everything she'd never dared to dream of. The words were there, pressing against her teeth like caged birds desperate to fly. "I killed a man. I cut his throat and watched him die. I'm not the woman you think I am." "Instead," she said, "what if I can't give you children? What if I'm not? What if I'm broken somehow?" Thomas rose and came to her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Elena, whatever you've been through, whatever you've seen, it doesn't change how I feel about you. We all carry scars. The only thing that matters is what we do moving forward." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his trust like stones in her chest. She wanted to lean into his strength, to let his faith in her become the truth. But the locket in her pocket pulsed with accusation, and she could still see the preacher's eyes going dim in the moonlight. "Thomas," she whispered, "what if someone had done something terrible? Something that couldn't be undone? Would love be enough to forgive that?" He was quiet for a long moment, his hands still warm on her shoulders. "I think," he said finally, "that God's love is big enough to cover any sin. And if God can forgive, then maybe we can too." The words should have brought comfort, but Elena felt them like salt in an open wound. God might forgive, but would Thomas? When he learned what her hands had done, when he understood that she'd hidden the truth from him, would his love survive the telling? A coyote called from the hills, lonely and wild, and Elena shivered despite the warmth of Thomas's touch. Tomorrow was her wedding day, and she was no closer to finding the courage to tell him the truth. Instead, she was falling deeper into the lie, letting herself imagine a future where she could be the woman he believed her to be. But lies had weight, and Elena could feel hers pressing down on her chest like stones, making it hard to breathe. The sheriff was asking questions, following a trail that led straight to her. Time was running out, and she was no closer to finding the words that might save them both. That night, she lay in her narrow bed listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into sleep. The soft lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, the distant howl of something wild and free. Tomorrow, she would walk down the aisle carrying her father's name and a killer's secret, praying that love might be strong enough to hold them both. But in her heart, Elena knew that some truths were too heavy for even the strongest love to carry. And some stains never washed clean, no matter how pure the water or how gentle the hands that did the washing. As sleep finally claimed her, Elena dreamed of wildflowers growing from blood-soaked ground, beautiful and impossible, while somewhere in the darkness, truth waited with the patience of a hunter. Thomas found a blood-stained dress hidden beneath her wedding gown, and in that moonlit stable, Elena's darkest secret would either destroy them both or forge a love stronger than any lie. The wedding dress hung from the wardrobe door like a ghost, white silk that caught the lamplight and seemed to glow with its own innocence. Elena sat before the small mirror, brushing her hair with slow, deliberate strokes, watching her reflection and wondering if Thomas would still want to marry her when the sun rose. The sheriff had returned that afternoon, his questions sharper, his eyes more focused. He'd asked Mrs. Brennan about strangers passing through, about anyone who might have been traveling near Bitter Creek 3 weeks ago. Elena had stayed in her room, claiming a headache, but she'd heard every word through the thin walls. Preacher's name was Josiah Mills, Sheriff Watson had said. Good man by all accounts. Brought the word to places that needed it most. Whoever killed him took something from his body, his silver locket with his wife's picture. Crime of passion, maybe, or robbery gone wrong. Elena's hand had gone to her pocket instinctively, feeling the weight of that same locket through the fabric of her dress. The irony was bitter as poison. The sheriff was describing her victim as a good man, a godly man, while she sat hiding in a room filled with wedding preparations. Now, with midnight approaching and her wedding only hours away, Elena could no longer carry the weight alone. She pulled the locket from her pocket and held it to the lamplight, studying the woman's face trapped behind the glass. She was young and pretty, with kind eyes that reminded Elena painfully of Mrs. Brennan. Someone's daughter. Someone's wife. Someone who would never know why her husband had died in the dust outside a forgotten town. A soft knock at the door made Elena jump. She shoved the locket beneath her pillow and called out, "Come in." Thomas entered, carrying a small oil lamp and wearing the uncertain expression of a man who knew he was breaking propriety. "I know I shouldn't be here," he said quietly, "but I couldn't sleep, and I saw your lights still burning." Elena pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. In the lamplight, Thomas looked younger somehow, vulnerable in a way that made her chest ache. "You should go. It's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding." "Maybe." He set his lamp on the dresser and turned to face her. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." The words hit her like ice water. "What do you mean?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands working the brim of his hat. "The sheriff. He's been asking questions about you. About where you've been, who you've traveled with. And I see how you look sometimes, like you're carrying something heavy. Like you're afraid." Elena felt the room tilt around her. "I don't know what you're talking about. I found this in your saddlebags." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of cloth, the torn fabric she'd used to wrap the locket, stained with rusty brown spots that could only be blood. "I was checking your horse's tack, making sure everything was ready for tomorrow, and this fell out." The cloth seemed to fill the space between them, damning as any confession. Elena stared at it, her mind racing for explanations that wouldn't come. The silence stretched like a held breath, broken only by the distant sound of wind through the cottonwoods. "Elena." Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. "Tell me the truth." She could lie. She could say it was from a cut finger, a bloody nose, anything but what it really was. But looking at Thomas's face, at the trust and hope and genuine love she saw there, Elena found she couldn't add another lie to the weight she already carried. "I killed a man," she said, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. Thomas went very still. The lamplight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called from the darkness. Elena watched his face for the horror, the disgust, the fear she knew would come. Instead, Thomas set the bloody cloth on the dresser and asked quietly, "Why?" The simple question broke something open in Elena's chest. She'd expected judgment, condemnation, rejection. She prepared for everything except understanding. The tears came before she could stop them, hot and shameful on her cheeks. "His name was Josiah Mills," she whispered, "a traveling preacher. He seemed so godly, so kind when he spoke to Papa about blessing our journey. But when Papa went into the saloon that night, Elena's voice caught, and she had to force the words out like pulling thorns from her throat. He cornered me by our wagon. Said God had told him I was meant to be his comfort for the night." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. "I told him no, told him I was promised to another. But he wouldn't listen. His hands, they were everywhere, tearing at my dress, pressing me against the wagon wheel. I had Papa's knife in my boot, and when he wouldn't stop, when I thought he was going to..." Elena's breath came in ragged gasps. "I cut his throat. Quick and clean like Papa taught me. He died looking surprised, like he couldn't believe a girl like me would fight back." The confession hung between them like smoke, heavy and bitter. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, waiting for Thomas to turn away, to call for the sheriff, to do what any decent man would do when faced with a killer. Instead, Thomas knelt beside her chair, his hands gentle on hers. "Elena, look at me." She met his eyes, expecting to see disgust or fear. Instead, she found something that looked like sorrow, but not for the reason she'd expected. "That man hurt you," Thomas said, his voice rough with barely controlled anger. "He tried to force himself on you, and you defended yourself. That's not murder, Elena. That's survival." "But I killed him," Elena whispered. "I took a life. You saved your own." Thomas's hands tightened on hers. "What you did. Any man worth his salt would have done the same if someone tried to hurt his daughter. You were protecting yourself, and that's not a sin." Elena shook her head, pulling away from his touch. "You don't understand. I took his locket. I kept it like some kind of trophy. I've been carrying it around like—" She reached beneath her pillow and pulled out the tarnished silver, holding it between them like evidence of her damnation, like proof of what I am. Thomas took the locket from her trembling hands and studied it in the lamplight. The bloodstains were dark against the silver, permanent as scars. Inside, the picture of the unknown woman smiled up at them with trusting eyes. "You kept it because you felt guilty," Thomas said finally. "Because taking a life, even in self-defense, marked you. You've been carrying this guilt like a punishment. Aren't I guilty?" Thomas was quiet for a long time, turning the locket over in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was measured and thoughtful. "My grandfather fought in the war between the states. Killed more men than he could count, and it haunted him till the day he died. But he told me once that there's a difference between killing because you want to and killing because you have to. One makes you a monster. The other just makes you human." Elena felt something crack open in her chest, a grief she'd been holding back since that night in Bitter Creek. "But I ran. I didn't stay to tell anyone what really happened. I just ran like a coward." "You ran because you knew no one would believe you," Thomas said. "An outlaw's daughter against a preacher's word? Even dead, his reputation would have carried more weight than your truth. You ran because you were smart, not because you were guilty." The tears came harder now, years of shame and fear pouring out like water from a broken dam. Thomas pulled her into his arms, and Elena let herself collapse against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her cheek. "The sheriff," she gasped between sobs. "He's getting close. Tomorrow, maybe the next day, he'll figure it out. He'll come for me. Then we'll face it together," Thomas said, his voice firm with resolve. "We'll tell him the truth, all of it. And if that's not enough, if the law won't see justice in what you did, then we'll figure out something else." Elena pulled back to look at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt or fear. "You do that? Risk everything for me?" Thomas cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gentle against her cheeks. "Elena, I made a choice to marry you before I ever met you. Not because of some arrangement between our fathers, but because I believe there had to be something worth saving in any daughter who survived what you survived. Now that I know you, now that I see who you really are, that choice feels like the easiest one I've ever made. Even knowing what I've done, especially knowing what you've done." Thomas leaned his forehead against hers. "You protected yourself when no one else would. You've been carrying guilt that isn't yours to carry. And you were willing to sacrifice your own happiness rather than bring danger to my family. If that's not the mark of a good woman, I don't know what is." Elena closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, soap and leather and honest work. For the first time since that night in Bitter Creek, she felt something that might have been peace. Not the absence of guilt, but the presence of someone willing to share the weight of it. "What happens now?" she whispered. Thomas kissed her forehead, soft as a benediction. "Now we get married. We face whatever comes together. And we build something good on the foundation of truth instead of lies." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of coming rain. Elena thought of the sheriff, probably sleeping in the town's small hotel, his questions still unanswered but getting closer to the truth with every passing hour. Tomorrow would bring her wedding, but it might also bring judgment. But for tonight, in this moment, she was not alone with her secret. Thomas knew what she'd done, and he was still here, still holding her, still promising a future that might be possible if they were brave enough to fight. Elena pulled the locket from Thomas's hands and walked to the window. The moon was full and bright, turning the yard silver with its light. She opened the window and threw the locket as hard as she could, watching it disappear into the darkness like a shooting star falling to earth. "What did you do?" Thomas asked. "Let it go," Elena said, turning back to him. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm not carrying that weight anymore. If the sheriff comes, if the truth comes out, we'll face it clean. No more lies. No more secrets." Thomas smiled, and in that smile, Elena saw something she'd never seen before. Not just love, but respect. He saw her for exactly what she was, and he chose her anyway. As the locket disappeared into the night, Elena felt something shift inside her chest. Not the absence of guilt, but the presence of hope that tomorrow's truth might set them both free. When the sheriff rode up to arrest the bride on her wedding morning, Thomas Brennan faced the choice that would define his soul: stand with law and order, or defend the woman who'd killed to protect herself. Dawn came slow and reluctant, as if the sun itself hesitated to light what the day might. Elena woke to the sound of horses in the yard and knew, with the certainty that comes from living too long with fear, that her time had run out. She dressed carefully in her wedding gown, white silk that misses. Brennan had spent weeks altering, with pearl buttons that caught the early light like tears. The irony wasn't lost on her, standing before the mirror in virgin white while preparing to confess to murder. But the dress felt right somehow, not as a lie, but as hope. Hope that she might emerge from this day clean. Downstairs, she could hear voices on the porch, tense and low. Sheriff Watson's drawl, William Brennan's careful diplomacy, and beneath it all, Thomas's voice, steady as bedrock. Elena took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked down to meet her fate. The sheriff stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, his badge catching the morning sun like a small, merciless star. Behind him waited two deputies, young men who looked uncomfortable with whatever they'd been asked to do. Thomas stood between them and the house, his jaw set with quiet determination. "Sheriff," Elena said, stepping onto the porch. "You're looking for me." Sheriff Watson studied her with eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. "Miss Cartwright, I need to ask you some questions about your whereabouts 3 weeks ago. Specifically, the night of October 3rd, near Bitter Creek." Elena felt Mrs. Brennan's sharp intake of breath, saw William's face go pale with understanding. But Thomas stepped closer to her side, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence like armor against the cold wind of judgment. "I was there," Elena said simply, "and I killed Josiah Mills." The words fell into the morning silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the gathered crowd. "Mrs." Brennan gripped the porch rail, her face white as her apron. William stepped back as if Elena had become something dangerous. But Thomas moved closer, his shoulder touching hers in silent solidarity. "Elena," Sheriff Watson said, his voice heavy with regret, "I'm going to need you to come with me." "No." The word came from Thomas, quiet but firm as mountain stone. "You're going to need to hear the whole story first." Sheriff Watson's hand moved to his gun belt, but Thomas raised his hands, showing he was unarmed. "I'm not resisting, Sheriff. I'm just asking for justice. Real justice, not just the easy kind." "Thomas, don't," Elena whispered. "This isn't your fight. It is now." Thomas turned to face the sheriff, and Elena saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not just love, but righteous anger. "Sheriff, did your investigation tell you what kind of man Josiah Mills really was?" "He was a preacher," Watson replied stiffly. "A man of God. He was a predator." Thomas's voice carried across the yard like a bell tolling judgment. "He cornered Elena when her father was away. tried to force himself on her. She defended herself, as any woman should have a right to do. That's just her word, one of the deputies said, his hand resting on his pistol. Word of an outlaw's daughter against a dead preacher. Then let me give you mine, Thomas said, his voice rising now, carrying the authority of a man who'd never told a lie that mattered. I believe her. I've seen the fear in her eyes, the way she startles at unexpected touch. I've heard her wake screaming from nightmares she won't talk about. That's not the behavior of a cold-blooded killer. That's the behavior of a woman who's been hurt and had to hurt back to survive. Elena stared at Thomas, amazed by his fierce defense of her, by the way he stood between her and judgment like a shield made of faith and love. She'd expected him to step away when the truth came out, to choose his reputation over her life. Instead, he was choosing her over everything, his family's standing, his own safety, his future. Thomas, she said, her voice breaking, you don't have to do this. Yes, I do. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were blazing with something that looked like glory. Elena, I asked you to marry me. That means standing with you when the world stands against you. It means believing in you when you can't believe in yourself. Sheriff Watson shifted uncomfortably, his certainty wavering in the face of Thomas's conviction. Even if what you say is true, she still killed a man. Law's the law. Whose law? Thomas demanded. The law that says a woman can't defend herself against a man trying to rape her? The law that protects predators because they wear the right clothes and speak the right words? That's not justice, Sheriff. That's just power protecting itself. A crowd had gathered now, ranch hands drawn by the raised voices, neighbors who'd come early for the wedding, townspeople curious about the commotion. Elena saw their faces, some sympathetic, others suspicious, all waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Mrs. Brennan stepped forward then, her flower-dusted apron fluttering in the morning breeze. Sheriff Watson, she said, her voice trembling but determined, I've known Elena for 2 days, and in that time I've seen her gentle with the horses, kind to me, and respectful to my husband. She's helped in my kitchen without being asked, mended Thomas's shirt without being told, and carried herself with the dignity of a woman who's known hardship but not given up hope. Does that sound like a cold-blooded killer? Other voices joined hers then. Jake, the ranch foreman, spoke of how Elena had helped bandage his injured hand. Mrs. Patterson from town mentioned how Elena had given her last coins to a hungry child outside the general store. Small kindnesses, daily graces that painted a picture very different from the one the sheriff had been carrying. I've heard enough testimonies about traveling preachers taking liberties, called out Martha Hendricks, the schoolteacher. Maybe it's time we started asking harder questions about men who use God's name to justify ungodly acts. Sheriff Watson looked around at the gathered crowd, seeing his clear-cut case of murder dissolving into something more complicated, more human. The law. The law should protect the innocent. William Brennan interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd built his reputation on fairness. And if this girl killed in self-defense, then she is innocent, no matter what the man's profession was. Elena felt something she'd never experienced before, the sensation of being defended, of having others stand between her and judgment. But it was Thomas's unwavering presence beside her that gave her the courage to speak. I won't run anymore, she said, her voice clear in the morning air. I won't hide from what I did. Josiah Mills tried to hurt me, and I stopped him the only way I could. I took his locket because I wanted to remember that even when we have to do terrible things to survive, we should never forget the weight of taking a... She reached into her dress and pulled out the locket. Not the one she'd thrown away the night before, but another piece of torn cloth, this one wrapped around a small silver cross she'd worn since childhood. I've been carrying guilt that doesn't belong to me, and fear of a truth that needed telling. I'm ready to face whatever judgment comes, but I won't let good people suffer for standing with me. Sheriff Watson was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces around him, weighing law against justice, duty against mercy. Finally, he holstered his gun and stepped back. "Miss Cartwright," he said formally, "based on the testimony I've heard here today, and given the circumstances of the case, I'm ruling Keziah Mills's death a case of justifiable homicide in self-defense. There will be no charges filed." The crowd exhaled as one, relief washing over them like rain after drought. Elena felt her knees buckle, and Thomas caught her, his arms strong and sure around her waist. "However," the sheriff continued, "I'll need a full written statement from you about what happened. For the official record." "She'll provide it," Thomas said firmly. "We'll come to town after the wedding." Sheriff Watson nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "Then I suppose I should wish you both congratulations." He paused, looking directly at Elena. "Miss, what you went through, no woman should have to face that alone. I'm sorry the law wasn't there to protect you when you needed it most." As the sheriff and his deputies rode away, the crowd began to disperse, but not before offering words of support, touches of comfort, invitations to dinner that spoke of acceptance rather than judgment. Elena stood in the center of it all, overwhelmed by the grace of strangers who'd chosen to see her as human rather than monster. "Are you ready to get married?" Thomas asked softly, his hand warm in hers. Elena looked around at the ranch that had become a haven, at the people who'd defended her, at the man who'd stood between her and judgment without hesitation. The guilt was still there, it would always be there, but it no longer felt like a chain around her soul. Instead, it felt like a reminder of her own strength, her own worth, her own right to fight for the life she wanted. "Yes," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The wedding took place in the yard rather than the church, under the open sky, with the mountains as witnesses. Elena wore wildflowers in her hair, not the carefully arranged blooms Mrs. Brennan had planned, but the simple daisies and lupin that Thomas had been bringing her every morning. They spoke their vows in voices that carried across the valley, promising not perfection but presence, not innocence but truth. When Thomas kissed her, Elena tasted possibility on his lips, the possibility of peace, of forgiveness, of a future built on honesty instead of fear. The crowd cheered, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed contentedly in their pastures. That evening, as the celebration wound down and the last guests rode home under a canopy of stars, Elena and Thomas walked to the creek where they'd first talked about the future. Elena carried a small apple sapling William had given them as a wedding gift, its roots wrapped in burlap and its branches reaching toward the night sky. "Where should we plant it?" Thomas asked. Elena looked around at the land that was now hers too, at the creek that ran clear and cold, at the mountains that stood eternal against the darkness. She chose a spot near the water where the tree would have room to grow and shade to offer future generations. As they dug together in the soft earth, their hands working side by side in the moonlight, Elena felt the last of her old life settling into the ground like seeds. The tree would grow here, its roots reaching deep into soil that had been watered with tears and tended with love. Its fruit would feed children who would never know the weight their mother had carried, would never have to understand that sometimes survival requires terrible choices. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, his voice soft in the darkness. Elena looked at her husband. The words still felt strange and wonderful on her tongue, and saw her future reflected in his eyes. Not a future free from the past, but one where the past had been transformed into something that could nurture rather than destroy. "I'm thinking about forgiveness," she said. "How it doesn't erase what happened, but it makes room for what might come next." Thomas covered her dirty hands with his own. "And what's coming next?" Elena smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Everything," she said. "Everything good and hard and worth fighting for." Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, and the creek sang its quiet song of water finding its way home. The apple tree stood small and vulnerable in the moonlight, but its roots were already reaching deep, already beginning the slow work of transforming earth into life. In the distance, a coyote called from the hills, wild and free, and Elena no longer heard it as a sound of loneliness. Instead, It sounded like a song of survival, a hymn to all the fierce, imperfect creatures who fought their way toward morning and found, against all odds, that love was waiting there to meet them. The outlaw's daughter had come home at last, not by forgetting who she was, but by finding someone who could love her because of it. And in the end, that made all the difference between justice and mercy, between surviving and truly living. As they walked back toward the house hand in hand, Elena felt the weight of the future settling on her shoulders, not heavy like guilt, but solid like purpose. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own tests of faith and love. But tonight, she was Elena Brennan, wife and survivor, woman and warrior, carrying hope instead of shame. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. In the end, love's greatest triumph was not in the perfection of the beloved, but in the courage to stand with truth when the whole world might turn away. And in that standing, to discover that mercy lives not in the absence of judgment, but in the presence of grace.